She was 19 years old, and she had $1 to her name, and on the morning this story begins, she spent it on a building full of books that a whole town had been trying to forget for 60 years. Her name was Ivy Marsh, and the thing she bought was the old Shuttered bookstore on Chestnut Street in the river town of Carrollton, Missouri. A narrow brick building with its windows boarded and its door locked that had stood closed and untouched since before anyone now living in Carrollton had been born, and that the town, in a strange quiet way it never quite explained to itself, did not like to talk about. The bookstore had belonged to a woman named Eliza Thorne, and she had died in 1868, and the store had never opened again. That much everyone knew. She had been the town's bookseller in the years before and after the war, a spinster, a woman of learning in a place and time that did not much value learning in a woman, and she had kept in her narrow brick building on Chestnut Street the only bookstore for 50 miles, and she had died in the winter of 1868, and the store had been shuttered. And it had stayed shuttered for 60 years, its stock still inside, its windows boarded, passing down through a tangle of distant heirs who never came, and a county that eventually took it for taxes and could never sell it. Because who would buy a building full of 60-year-old rotting books in a river town that had long since stopped reading? Ivy Marsh would. Ivy Marsh had wanted that building her whole life, with a wanting she could not fully explain even to herself, and when it came up at last on the county's list of forfeit properties, offered for the $1 of the filing fee to anyone fool enough to take it, she was at the courthouse door before it opened, with her last $1 in her hand. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ivy Marsh, and the Shuttered bookstore, and the door behind the shelves that had been nailed shut since 1868. And if a story of buried books and a buried truth is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand why a penniless girl would spend her last $1 on a dead woman's bookstore, you have to understand what books had been to Ivy Marsh, and what Eliza Thorne had been to the town of Carrollton, and what had happened in Carrollton in 1868 that the town had spent 60 years not talking about. Ivy Marsh had grown up poor, the daughter of a widowed washerwoman, in a town that offered a poor girl very little and expected less of her. But she had grown up with one treasure, and it was this: her mother could read, and read beautifully, and loved reading above almost anything, and had taught her daughter at the kitchen table by lamplight, and the two of them, the washerwoman and her girl, had lived a second secret life inside the first one, a life of borrowed books and recited poems and stories told over the mending, richer than anything their poverty could touch. Ivy would remember those evenings all her life as the true wealth of her childhood. The day's work done, the supper cleared, the lamp lit, and her mother, whose hands were cracked and red from other people's washing, would take down whatever book they had managed to borrow that month, and her voice, which was worn flat by the day, would open up and fill with all the voices of the story, and the little kitchen would fall away and they would be somewhere else entirely, anywhere, everywhere, the two of them together. Her mother read like a woman drinking water after a long thirst, and she taught Ivy to read the same way, not as a school exercise, but as a door, the one door in a poor girl's life that no one could lock against her. There are people in this world, her mother used to say, who will decide what you are the moment they look at you, and they will be wrong, and the way you will know they are wrong is that you will have read. And Ivy had read. She had read everything she could borrow or beg in a town with no library, and she had grown up with a hunger for books that Carrollton could never feed. And always. At the center of that hunger stood the shuttered building on Chestnut Street, the store full of books behind boarded windows, the treasure house locked in the middle of the starving town, and she had stood before it 100 times as a child, wondering, wanting. And Ivy's mother had always said, when Ivy asked where such a love of books had come from, to a washerwoman in a town like Carrollton, the same thing, that she had it from her own mother, Ivy's grandmother, who had it from Miss Eliza Thorne. For Ivy's grandmother, as a girl, had worked for Eliza Thorne in the bookstore on Chestnut Street, sweeping and dusting and minding the shop, and Miss Thorne had taught her to read. That was the kind of woman Eliza Thorne had been, Ivy's mother said. She had taught half the poor children of Carrollton to read, quietly, in the back of her shop, girls especially, and children whose families could never have paid for schooling, and children in the years around the war, whom no school in that country would then take at all. Her bookstore had been more than a store. It had been, without ever calling itself so, the school and the library and the lamplit heart of every mind in Carrollton that hungered for more than the town thought it deserved, and Eliza Thorne had presided over it for 30 years, selling books to those who could pay and lending them to those who could not, and teaching anyone who asked. And the town's better sort had tolerated her as a harmless eccentric, and the town's poor had loved her as something very near a saint. And then she had died in the winter of 1868, and the store had been shuttered, and something strange had happened, or rather had failed to happen, and it was the shape of that strangeness, passed down to Ivy through her mother and grandmother, that had made Ivy Marsh want that building all her life. For Eliza Thorne had always said, all through her last years, that the store would not die with her. She had said it to Ivy's grandmother and to the other children she had taught. It was remembered among all the families whose children she had raised up into reading. She had told them that she had no kin worth the name, and that everything she had, the building and the books and the money she had quietly saved across 30 years, was to go, when she died, to the founding of a free library for Carrollton, a real one, open to everyone, poor and rich, girl and boy, everyone, with a fund to sustain it and a teacher to keep the lessons going, so that what she had done in the back of her shop for 30 years would go on forever and belong to the whole town. She had told them she had made her will and made it carefully and that it was all arranged. And then she died, and there was no will. That was the thing that happened, or failed to happen, in 1868. The will that Eliza Thorne had told a dozen families she had made was never found. The lawyers in the county searched, or said they searched, and no will appeared, and so the estate fell to the tangle of distant heirs, and the library was never founded, and the fund, if it existed, was never found either, and the store was shuttered with everything inside it, and the poor families who had been promised a library got nothing, and had no standing to ask, and the matter closed. And the town's better sort, it was noticed, closed it briskly. There had been men in Carrollton in 1868, men of property, who had never liked Eliza Thorne, who had not liked her teaching, had not liked whom she taught. In those bitter years just after the war, when the question of who should be taught to read was, in that state, a question men grew violent over, and those men had been foremost in seeing the estate settled quickly, the store shuttered, the strange spinster's affairs closed up and boarded over like her windows, and the whole business put away. And among the poor families of Carrollton, the families whose children Eliza Thorne had taught, a quiet conviction had taken root and been passed down 60 years, alongside the reading she had given them, that the will had existed, and that it had been made to disappear. Ivy Marsh had grown up on that conviction, third in the line of it. The reading and the belief passed down together from the grandmother Miss Thorne taught, and when the shuttered store came up at last for $1, Ivy spent her dollar, and the town shook its head at the washerwoman's girl buying 60 years of rotten paper, and Ivy Marsh took the key from the county clerk and walked down Chestnut Street and opened the door that had been locked since 1868. The inside of the store was dim and still, and smelled of dust and old paper and time, and it was, despite 60 years, whole. The roof had held. That was the mercy of it. The rain had never gotten in, and the store stood as Eliza Thorne had left it, or as the men who shuttered it had left it, the shelves ranked from floor to ceiling down both long walls and across the back. Still loaded with their books, 60 years of dust gone soft and gray over everything, the little counter with its ledger still lying open, A reading table, a cold stove, and the deep quiet of a room where time had been boarded up along with everything else. Ivy Marsh stood in the middle of it with her lamp and turned slowly around, and she felt, she would say afterward, that she had walked into her own grandmother's girlhood, into the very room where the whole lamplit second life of her family had been kindled 60 years before, and that the room had been waiting for someone of that lineage to come back. She spent her first weeks simply learning what she had. She moved into the store itself, making a bed in the corner by the cold stove, for she had nowhere else and the building was hers, and she woke each morning in the gray book-scented light and worked all day at the cleaning and the sorting, shelf by shelf, and it was the happiest she had ever been, penniless in a dusty ruin. Because she was living, at last, inside the treasure house she had stood outside of all her life. She handled every book. She dusted them and opened them and read their title pages and set them in order, and as she worked, she came to know Eliza Thorne the way you can only know a person through their books, through what they chose and kept and loved. And she came to feel the old bookseller's presence in the store, kindly and particular, watching the work with approval. And what she had, she began to understand as she cleaned and sorted and read, was more than a ruin. Many of the books had suffered, mice and damp at the edges and the slow chemistry of time, but many had not. And among the ones that had not, as Ivy worked her way along the shelves, she began to find things that made her breath catch. For Eliza Thorne had been a bookseller of taste and learning far beyond what a Missouri river town required, and her shelves held, scattered among the ordinary stock, books that even Ivy's untrained eye could tell were fine and rare and old. Books that a knowing collector would value dearly. The Shuttered store was not worthless. It had never been worthless. It was a 60-year time capsule of a discerning mind, and it was worth, Ivy began to suspect, a very great deal. But that was not the discovery. The discovery came in the third week, and it came, fittingly, because Ivy Marsh did what she had been raised to do, which was to pay attention to books. She was cleaning and cataloging the great wall of shelves across the back of the store, the tallest and deepest of them, and she noticed, first, a small strangeness that the books on those back shelves were not like the others. Everywhere else in the store, Eliza Thorne's stock was arranged with a bookseller's care, by subject and author, in an order Ivy had come to know. But the back wall was a jumble, books of every kind shelved without sense, doubles of things shelved elsewhere, cheap and fine mixed anyhow, as though the shelves had been filled in haste by someone who did not care what went where. And Ivy, who had spent 3 weeks learning the mind of Eliza Thorne through the order of her store, stood before that senseless back wall and thought, she did not shelve these. Someone else did. Someone filled this wall in a hurry, to make it look like the rest of the store. And whoever it was did not love books, and did not know how a bookseller's shelves are kept. And then she noticed the second thing, the thing a less attentive eye would never have caught, that the back wall of shelves was deeper than it should be. She had measured the store, pacing it out as she planned her cleaning, and the inside of the store was shorter, back to front, than the outside of the building by a good 4 feet. Somewhere behind that jumbled wall of shelves, there was space unaccounted for. She measured it again to be sure, pacing the alley outside along the building's flank, counting her steps, and then pacing the inside from the front door to the back shelves, and the difference held, 4 feet of building that the inside of the store did not contain. She stood before the jumbled back wall a long while that evening with her lamp, putting the two strangenesses together, the shelves that no bookseller had filled, and the space that no room accounted for, and the answer assembled itself in her with a cold, rising certainty. The back wall of shelves was not a wall of the store. It was a screen. It had been built, or filled, in haste, by hands that did not love books, in front of something to hide it, and it had stood hiding it for 60 years, in plain sight, in the one place in Carrollton no one ever came. Every family conviction of 3 generations, every quiet certainty passed down from her grandmother's day, gathered itself behind her heart as she stood there, and she thought, "This is it." Whatever they did in 1868, they did it here, and it is still here, 4 feet behind these shelves, where they left it. It took her a day to find the way in, and when she found it, it was not a hidden catch or cunning mechanism. It was plainer than that, and grimmer. Behind the center section of the back shelving, when she had emptied it and worked the heavy case away from the wall, there was a door, an ordinary door that had once led to a back room. And the door had been nailed shut, not locked, nailed, with heavy nails driven ugly and crooked through the door and deep into the frame, dozens of them, the work of someone in haste and without craft, and over the nailed door the shelving had been built and the jumbled books piled in, so that the door should not only be sealed but forgotten, erased, as though the room behind it had never been. Ivy Marsh stood before the nailed door with her lamp, and she thought of the will that a dozen families had been promised and that had never been found, and of the men of property who had closed up Eliza Thorne's affairs so briskly in 1868, and of 60 years of her own family's quiet conviction, and she went and got the pry bar. The nails were 60 years rusted, and they screamed as they came, one by one, out of the old wood, and it took her the better part of the day, working carefully so as not to wreck the door or whatever lay behind it, and it was evening, and her lamp was lit, when the last nail gave, and the door that had been nailed shut in 1868 swung open on the room behind. She stood a long moment on the threshold before she went in, her lamp held up, her heart going hard, for the air that came out of the opened room was the air of 1868, closed up with everything else, and she had the feeling, which she never afterward thought foolish, that she was being permitted to enter, that the room had judged her and found her the right one, the one it had been keeping itself for. Then she stepped through the door that no living person had passed in 60 years. It was Eliza Thorne's own room, her study, her sanctuary, the private heart of the store, and it was untouched, sealed for 60 years, exactly as it had been in the last winter of her life. A small room with a desk and a lamp and a worn armchair, a narrow bed, shelves of her own dearest books, and everywhere, on the desk and the shelves, the papers and letters of a long, full life. There was a shawl still over the back of the armchair. There was a teacup on the desk, its tea 60 years evaporated to a brown shadow in the bottom. There was a book lying open, face down, on the arm of the chair, exactly where a reader sets a book when she means to come back to it in a moment, and Ivy Marsh stood in the lamplight, looking at that open book, and felt the tears come, for it was the room of a woman who had gone out of it expecting to return, and had died instead, and the men who came after had not even granted her room the decency of being packed away, but had nailed it up with her teacup and her shawl and her unfinished book inside, entombed mid-breath, and left it so for 60 years. Whoever had nailed the door had not ransacked the room. That was the strange mercy of it, and Ivy understood it as she stood there. They had not dared. Whatever they had been looking for or fearing, they had chosen not to search this room paper by paper. Where they might be seen or interrupted or might miss the thing after all, they had chosen instead to bury the whole room, nail it shut and shelve it over and let the building rot around it, so that whatever was in it would never be found by anyone. It was not a search. It was an entombment. The men of 1868 had not found and destroyed Eliza Thorne's will. They had sealed it in, unfound, with everything else, and gambled that a boarded building in a forgetting town would keep it hidden forever. And it was there. Ivy Marsh found it that same night, because Eliza Thorne had left it where a careful woman leaves her most important paper, in the strongbox in the bottom drawer of her desk. And the strongbox was locked, but its key was in the teapot on the shelf, because Eliza Thorne had hidden things from thieves, not from the friend or heir she trusted would one day sit at her desk. In the strongbox was the will, made and signed and witnessed in the autumn of 1867, in Eliza Thorne's clear, strong hand, and it said exactly what she had promised a dozen families it would say: the building, the books, and the fund, the whole of her estate, left in trust for the founding of the Carrollton Free Library, open to all the people of the town without regard to means. With a schoolroom and a teacher's stipend, forever, and beneath the will, in the same strongbox, were the bank documents of the fund itself, the quiet savings of 30 years, deposited in a St. Louis bank under a trust arrangement Eliza Thorne had built with a St. Louis lawyer, deliberately outside the reach of Carrollton's men of property, because, as her own note among the papers said, in a line that made Ivy's spine cold, she had begun to fear, in her last year, that certain men in Carrollton would never suffer her library to exist, and had taken her precautions accordingly. She had taken every precaution but one. She had not imagined they would simply nail the room shut. And there was one thing more in the strongbox, and it was the thing that turned a recovered will into a reckoning. Eliza Thorne, careful woman, had kept letters. Among her papers was a small bundle, tied and labeled in her hand, and it held the letters that certain men of Carrollton had sent her in her last years, and copies she had kept of her replies. And the letters told the whole ugly story that the town had spent 60 years not telling. The warnings, first veiled and then plain, that she should give up her teaching of those the town's better sort did not wish taught. The offers, increasingly insistent, to buy her building for purposes she understood too well. And finally the threats, barely covered in lawyers' language, of what might befall a woman alone and her fire trap of a store if she persisted. She had persisted. And she had kept every letter, dated and preserved, the signatures plain, and the names signed to those letters were names that Ivy Marsh knew. Names that were still, 60 years later, the leading names of Carrollton, the families whose grandfathers had been the men of property in 1868. The same men who had seen the estate closed so briskly, the store shuttered so fast, the door, Ivy understood now beyond any doubt, nailed. What followed took 2 years, and Ivy Marsh did it carefully, for she was a poor girl alone against the leading names of her town, and she had learned from 3 generations of women how such contests go when they are fought carelessly. She did not stand in the street and shout what she had found. She took the will and the trust documents and the letters, and she went, as Eliza Thorne herself had gone 60 years before, outside Carrollton, to the St. Louis Bank, which still existed, and where the trust, to the astonishment of everyone but Ivy, still stood. 60 years of quiet interest having grown Eliza Thorne's 30 years of savings into a sum that made the bank's own officers sit down when they traced it, and to the courts, with the will which was valid and proven, and which no passage of years could void. For a trust deliberately hidden from its beneficiaries does not expire while it lies buried. And the law. When the whole story was laid before it, the will, the fund, the letters, the nailed door, took the view that 60 years of theft by entombment would now be unwound in full. The Carrollton Free Library was founded at last, 60 years late, in the very building on Chestnut Street, exactly as Eliza Thorne's will provided, with her books as its first collection, the rare and the fine among them valued and kept as its treasures, and her fund, grown vast with its 60 patient years, as its endowment. Enough now not only for the library and the schoolroom and the teacher she had provided for, but for more than she had dared dream. The opening of it was a day the town never forgot. They came from every street of Carrollton, and from the farms around, drawn by the story that had run through the county like fire. And they filled Chestnut Street from end to end, and when the doors of the old shuttered store were opened at last, not to be looted or settled or sealed, but simply opened, to everyone, the first through the doors by Ivy's own arrangement were the children. The poor children of Carrollton streaming into the treasure house that had been locked against their parents and grandparents for 60 years, running their hands along the loaded shelves, and behind them came the old people, and there were among the old people that day 3 or 4, very old now, who had been children themselves in the back of Eliza Thorne's shop, who had been taught their letters by the woman herself, and who walked through the reopened store weeping openly, touching the shelves, standing a long while at the open door of the preserved study where her shawl still lay over the chair, and one of them, a very old woman, was heard to say, to no one in particular, that Miss Thorne had always told them the store would not die with her, and that it had taken 60 years. But Miss Thorne had never once in her life been wrong. And the story came out with it, all of it, proven in the letters in the leading family's grandfather's own hands, how the men of 1868 had tried to frighten a spinster bookseller out of teaching the town's poor, and had failed while she lived, and had buried her bequest when she died, nailing shut a door on a whole town's inheritance because they could not bear whom it would have taught. The leading names of Carrollton did not go to prison. Their grandfathers were 60 years dead. But they had to live ever after in a town that knew, a town whose library stood on Chestnut Street as a daily monument to what their families had tried to bury, and there is a kind of justice in that which no court can improve upon. And Ivy Marsh, the washerwoman's daughter who had spent her last dollar on the Shuttered store, was made by the terms of Eliza Thorne's own will, which provided for a librarian and teacher at a proper stipend, the first librarian of the Carrollton Free Library. And there was never any question, in the town or the courts or anyone's mind, that the post was hers. For she was the granddaughter of a girl Miss Thorne had taught to read, the third generation of a lineage of readers the old bookseller had kindled, and it was as though the will, waiting 60 years behind the nailed door, had been waiting for her in particular, the heir not of Eliza Thorne's blood, but of her true line, the line of the taught. Ivy Marsh kept that library for 50 years. She taught, in the back schoolroom, 3 more generations of Carrollton's children, poor and rich, girl and boy, everyone, exactly as the will provided, and she told them, when they were old enough to understand it, the story of the room behind the shelves, and she kept Eliza Thorne's study exactly as she had found it, the desk and the lamp and the armchair preserved at the heart of the library, its door standing always open, so that no one in Carrollton could ever again pretend not to know what had been done, and what had been undone, and what a single stubborn learned woman's careful papers had outlasted. She had been 19 years old, and down to her last dollar, and she had spent it on a shuttered building full of rotting books that a whole town had agreed to forget. It was the best dollar she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the fortune in the trust, though that built something fine. It is that the men who nailed that door shut understood something true and feared it, which is that a book is not a harmless thing, and teaching is not a harmless thing, and that a room full of books with a teacher in it will change who a town's children become, and therefore who the town becomes, and they hated that, and they nailed the door on it. And the thing they did not understand, the thing that beat them in the end, is that what Eliza Thorne had truly built could not be nailed in, because it had already walked out the door years before, in the minds of the children she taught. They sealed her room, but her reading was already loose in the town, passed from a girl who swept her shop to that girl's daughter, to that daughter's daughter, 3 generations of lamplit kitchen tables, until it came walking back up Chestnut Street with $1 in its hand and a pry bar, and opened the door from the outside. You can nail shut a room. You cannot nail shut what has already been taught. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Who taught you to read, and who taught them? And how far back does your own lamplit line of readers go? To what forgotten teacher whose gift is still walking around in the world in you? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.